Thank you everyone for coming to our Social Justice Club, soon to be called Social Equity Alliance. My name is Linda Huang, and I'm a librarian at the Five Works branch, and we'll be discussing LGBTQIA+ issues by examining the article "Do Not Say Homosexual" invoice tabled at Georgia Basic Meeting, as well as the bill itself, Senate Bill 613. As librarians, we're information specialists that are here to simply bring you information and not persuade you of anything. Please be respectful of others. So let's talk about the language of the Georgia Senate Bill 613. It's also called the Common Humanity and Private Education Act. What are your thoughts on the phrases used in the bill, and what is its purpose?
So I thought that the language was very, I don't know, it was like roundabout, it was saying a lot. And it was almost like it was phrasing it in this positive, protective, but you're reading between the lines and you're like, wait, this is a reactionary bill that's intended to prevent education and prevent equality. Whereas you're trying to phrase it as like, we're promoting good things and we're banning bad things. But just the language, and I highlighted a couple things. I did find it interesting that one of the key things was sexual orientation at the beginning, but then they hardly ever mention it throughout. It's like they're avoiding it. They don't want to talk about it, so they're avoiding it because it's a Title IX protected classification. So they don't want to say you can't talk about it, but it's implied. Also, it's weird they keep talking about private schools, but it's definitely applies to public schools too. And I'm guessing maybe that part of it is in the part we don't see because it's not being changed. No private or non-public school or program subject to this chapter shall expend funds on any program, curriculum, project, or activity that directs, promotes, encourages, or compels students to personally affirm, adopt, or adhere to any of the following things. So it just lists these things that, I don't know, it's I guess it's hard to like express, but it's almost like they're saying, don't do these things. And some of them sound like positive things. And I'm not sure, sometimes the tense seems a little bit off. Like you're not allowed to have groups or assemblies that limit participation based on certain protected classes. And it's like, well, they're already protected classes. They're not doing these things. So I thought they were trying to, I thought it was deceptively worded. I guess that's one point I'm trying to make.
I feel like I found it very contradictory. I don't even know how to explain it. And maybe that's because I just don't understand like how to read a bill itself. Like I'm not familiar with the way that it, like the layout is and stuff. Which one was it? That with respect to their relationship to American values, slavery and racism are anything other than deviations from, betrayals of, or failures to live up to the authentic founding principles of the United States, which include liberty and equality. Like that one specifically kind of stood out to me.
Yeah, that one definitely, since my background's in history, that one feels weird to me as well.
Yeah.
It's like, wait, so what are we supposed to be doing here? Do you not want us to talk about the subject at all? Or do you want us to teach that slavery was abhorrent? What are we supposed to be doing here? Because we're going to have to talk about it because that's our history. And it almost sounds like you want us to like whitewash it. That's what I took from that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's definitely where like my brain was trying to like get there. And it feels like we're not allowed to talk about it, which kind of ties into the whole critical race theory discussion that's happening too. And I also find it interesting that throughout the bill, it only mentions race or sex for the most part, besides ethnicity and national origin, that kind of thing. It never solely ever says gender identity towards the bottom part of the bill. So I guess that's intentional because they don't believe that it's real, ? So they don't feel the need to put it in there since this is supposed to be anti-LGBTQIA+.
I think that the word they use is orientation instead of saying gender identity. So
so it's like we're encompassing, but just a little bit, but not really. But we'll make you think that we are.
if you're not teaching about these subjects and learning about them, you don't know how to have a conversation about them.
Mhm.
So you can't ban something that you don't know what it is and you can't define. So they're trying to ban something, but they don't even know what they're trying to ban.
100%.
There's a lot to unpack, and I think the problem with a lot of bills and legislation and ballot measures is that they tend to be worded in such a way where you're like, oh yeah, of course I would vote for that. That's a very positive thing. Of course, you know, I want everybody to be equal. But then you read between the lines and you realize, well, actually, it sounds like we don't want to acknowledge our past. We want to say things like, oh, I don't see color, I don't see race, I don't see the negativity in our past. We've moved past that. My people are not responsible for the enslavement of your people. So therefore, we shouldn't have to acknowledge it. But sadly, just like you were saying, Valerie and Manor, that's the reality of it. America was built on the backs of slaves. And a lot of it has to do with reclaiming, you know, America for white Americans only, and not acknowledging that they were not the first ones here, that Native Americans were. It's just so frustrating reading reading the bill. I've read it several times. And like you said, it's very, what was the word you used, Valerie? You said it was very deceptive, right? It is extremely deceptive. And a part that stood out to me was in chapter 2B under section 5. It says, in recent years, a growing number of Georgia's private and non-public schools have embraced curricula and programs based in critical theory. In practice, these developments have caused private schools to segregate students, staff, and parents by ethnicity, color, race, and national origin, to compel students to adopt language and attitudes that promote racial division and discrimination. I said, is that true? So I did some research, and so to a degree, it is true that private schools tend to be more segregated than public schools. However, it tends to be religious-based private schools that tend to segregate. If it's a secular private school, they tend to have a lot more diversity in enrollment. And I think the part that is crazy to me, that they're basing this idea that segregation is happening in private schools because of the teaching of critical theory. There's no proof of that anywhere, that that's causing that. So, I mean, there's straight out lying in the bill, which is, you know, not unheard of, but very frustrating and disappointing. So
Well, it's interesting because in that same paragraph that you were reading, it said, I also want to promote the concept that there is a hierarchy of the oppressor and the oppressed, and that one's race, gender, sexual orientation, color, or national origin irrevocably determines his or her place in the hierarchy. So they're saying that they don't want them to do that, but that's exactly what they're doing. So that was kind of like where my brain was like, this feels contradictory, because like y'all are saying that you don't want to have this hierarchy that, you know, was established by certain people, and then get all upset about it, but then you're literally just trying to reinforce that same hierarchy. You're just trying to spin it to where it will fit in your worldview.
And the private schools thing, I haven't read the book, but it's on my list, but I've listened to this interview with the author, and the book is Robert E. Lee and Me. And it's about a guy who, as a kid, he moves from Virginia, like loves Robert E. Lee, like that's what he's taught, like he's like the ultimate Southern gentleman, and he's just like to be admired, like this is the goal. And he comes and he moves to, I want to say it's like Winder, and he is enrolled in a private school, which he refers to as, and this is a new concept for him, but as a seg academy, a segregated academy. And that the history is that during desegregation, parents did not want white children and black children in the same schools. And so especially, you know, white flight and all that, but they started all these private schools, and they were for white kids. So that you're saying in this bill, that you want to avoid segregation when many of these schools were founded to maintain segregation. So they don't know their history either. I still need to read this book, but even the interview, was really educational. I've come across more references to this otherwise too. So it's not just like this one guy's interpretation, but yeah, so I think it's hypocritical.
Yeah, and that's what Lennon said in the chat. The language is very hypocritical. And that's a very good point, Valerie. Thank you for talking about the history of segregation in private schools, because that's a very good point. That kind of blows their bill out of the water in a way.
I also think it's interesting how they bring up the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to like help justify their bill, because I feel like they're taking the words that were in the Civil Rights Act and twisting it again to like fit their narrative. And they're saying, oh, we shouldn't discriminate, but also this whole bill is us discriminating against people that may choose to identify one way or some other way, or just like love who they want to love. So it's so, like Lennon said, like we've all been saying, it's just hypocritical, and it just seems so goofy to me that like they're gonna just wholeheartedly be like, yep, we're using this bill to like justify everything we're trying to do. And it's like, you know why that bill was made. Like, you know why we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then turn around and then try to circumvent it and then have Jim Crow laws and try to finagle your way into having those hierarchies continue to be in place today.
So Manor has posted the next question. If passed, how do you think the bill will affect Georgia classrooms and youth? How do you think it will affect the LGBTQIA plus community?
I think whether or not the bill is passed, it will 100% obviously have a negative impact, especially on LGBTQIA youth. And Ashley even says that LGBTQIA plus teens won't feel safe in areas where they should feel safe, which is 100% correct. And they'll have to hide who they really are from everyone just so that they can survive through school until they can have a chance to actually be who they are unapologetically. And it's interesting because even when I was growing up in school, we didn't really have these kinds of discussions. We never really talked about LGBTQIA people or the history in general, not really, not that I can remember. So it already feels like that was pretty backwards, and we're a relatively younger group of people, and that feels really backwards to me. But to think that like it's gonna go even more backwards, and I think it's inevitable. The people who are a part of this community are gonna know that something about them is different, whether it's addressed in school or not. Because at the end of the day, school will only teach you so much. It's also about your upbringing, parents, your guardians, the people that you are exposed to before you go to school, outside of school, throughout school, and then, eventually to college. I think that will still help reinforce those ideas that, this exists and people like this exist and it's okay. So even if they don't teach it in school, which they barely did when I was in school, somehow I think people will find a way to learn about it, because the internet is the internet, and that will always be a resource that's available to those students, which it shouldn't have to be that way, but it feels like it might have to be that way.
In a way, it sounds like they think that teens or school-age kids are living in a bubble and they won't ever see other things other than what they are being taught. Yeah, just like you said.
Well, I think there is potential that the attempt to pass this sort of bill can have positive repercussions. We're having this conversation. It makes people more aware of potential to the dangers of this sort of thing. It might encourage people, like we saw in Florida, to come out and protest. There's a whole thing with Disney where the employees at Disney, who've always felt that that's been a safe environment, came out and said, hey, you're giving money to these politicians who are supporting this bill, and we don't like that. And so Disney was like, whoa, that's not what we're trying to do, and kind of stepped back. There's a whole, and it kept going. There's a whole thing. But it could encourage allies to speak up. But when this bill does get passed, it could be very dangerous, especially because it's unclear. What does this mean? When you say that no private or non-public school or program to which this applies shall promote, compel, or encourage classroom discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity in primary grade level or in a manner that is not appropriate for the age and developmental stage of the student. So you can't do it at all. You can't promote, compel, or encourage classroom discussion, but also, or in a manner that's not age appropriate. So if you've got a kid with two moms, two dads, whatever they have going on, are they not allowed to, you're not going to go around the room and say, hey, tell me what you did last summer. Oh, well, me and my two dads went on vacation. Oh, no. You don't get to talk today. How do you handle that? What exactly does that mean? It is certainly, in my opinion, age appropriate for a kid to say they have two dads. If a kid has a question about that, the teacher can just say, some families have two moms, some two dads, one of each, some grandma, sometimes it's aunt and uncle, and move on. You don't have to talk about sex. You can just say, our families are our families, and that's okay. But is that appropriate based on this bill? It's really not clear because they don't spell out a manner that is not appropriate. How do you define that?
I was going to say, it doesn't matter whether or not they're allowed to talk about it in school, because even as children are even growing up, before they even go to school, they're exposed to so many things and absorbing that information, whether you tell that to them directly or not, it's going to be absorbed. Now, it obviously biases will come into play there, and depending on who you grew up with and what they teach you, it might be a good thing, it might be a bad thing, it might be a neutral thing. Like exactly what Valerie said, it's not like you're just going to shut down a kid in the middle of class to be like, oh, sorry, you can't talk about your family. Like, that's so silly. That doesn't make any sense. Just because they have two parental figures that identify as the same gender or they're gender non-conforming, like, it doesn't make any sense.
I think you're right, because I one time at my last job had someone come out and complain that a commercial that had run featured a gay couple, and they didn't feel that was appropriate for, this was at a movie theater, to run before a kids show, and it's like, it was like a Coca-Cola commercial or something. So especially more and more in media now, I swear almost every TV commercial with a family, it is a mixed family. All these TV shows that come out now, Disney, everything has more diverse characters. So if you have a question about that and you go to your parents and you say, what's up with that? And they shut you down. You know what, who I'm going to ask? I'm going to ask my teacher, because my teacher's smart and my teacher's going to tell me. And so if then the teacher's like, I'm not allowed to talk about that, we can't talk about that, then you don't trust your teacher. And so that's someone that you potentially could reach out to as an ally, or just someone who is smart and you can't trust them. And so who do you reach out to then? Okay, that is a taboo subject. I'm not allowed to talk about it. Well, if I'm not allowed to talk about it, I'm not allowed to be it,
I was also going to add, with the whole developmental stage of the student and it being age appropriate, it's funny that they're saying, oh, you can't talk about LGBTQIA plus people in that community because it's not appropriate for a child's for the age that a child is. Yet we're literally absorbing and pushing cisgender relationships like the moment babies are born. They are seeing all of those things. They don't know the terminology because they don't understand those concepts, but cisgender relationships are literally pushed from the beginning. And if you don't want to talk about gender identities, then you shouldn't talk about cisgender identities either, because isn't that the same thing? Because if we can't talk about having two moms, two dads, two gender non-conforming, or a mix of those parents, then we shouldn't be talking about cisgender couples either, in the same, with that logic, you know?
I mean, all really great points. You were both, alluding to the fact that, if you're told not to talk about something, then it must not be okay to be that thing. And that's really detrimental to a child's mental health, detrimental to how they see their family, especially if they have a not an atypical family structure, and anything that's not a man and a wife, like you said, cisgender man and wife, that it's not okay. And that just bolsters the idea that this comes from a place that's more religion based, which that's another thing. Religion in school, it really is a free speech issue. And there was the NPR article, it was not just Florida, more than a dozen states proposed so-called don't say gay bills. So it outlines all the things that were prompted after the don't say gay bill that was passed in Florida. And there was a teacher who said that teaching about sexual orientation and gender identity isn't part of the first grade curriculum. But talking about families is a part of the curriculum. And, she said that would prevent kids from talking about their same-sex parents, whatever relationship, or parents, one parent, that would prevent them from being able to talk about who they are. And it's really sad. It's really just coming from a place of there's only one way to do things, and if you aren't doing it this one way, it's not okay. And that's just not how the world is. We all come from different backgrounds and different cultures and different experiences, and you can't just silence a group of people because they're different from you.
I can't believe I almost forgot to mention this. I had to Google it really quickly to see how recent this story was, but I was watching a YouTube video of this sort of political commentator, and he was actually watching this news story that Fox News put out about a trans child, and his name is Ryland. And the family, I believe, was a conservative family, and their child came out as transgender. And Republicans were going, and Fox News in general was going like crazy about the fact that they posted a positive LGBTQIA plus story on Ryland, because even though they were in a conservative family, his family was very open to letting him transition. The mom had said that she would rather have a living son than a dead daughter. And I thought it was genuinely very surprising that Fox News would run a story like that. I'm glad they did. But of course, they're going to get a ton of backlash from conservatives. I just thought the whole thing was a very interesting thing to witness, because I never thought I'd see the day that would happen. So that just came out like a couple days ago, 2-3 days ago. So it's definitely an interesting, and like Ben Shapiro went on like a whole mad Twitter like extravaganza about gender identity and everything, which I was like, okay, Ben. So I think it's interesting that came out too, in the midst of this bill also trying to be pushed.
I do think it's very interesting. I would be very curious. I'll take a look at the article to see what context they showed that feature in. But maybe it goes to show that, regardless of where you fall in the spectrum, politically, there's hope for you yet, to be inclusive and accepting of people. So I don't know, maybe there was a rogue person who just hit play, but
it could be someone who was staunchly against it. Maybe they had a family member who transitioned or something like that, and they learned to accept it and love. That's the hope, is that everyone humanizes the other and doesn't see the person as on the opposite side, that they're a human just like them, and that we all just want to be loved. Sorry, I know that's kind of like, but I think that's, I don't know. I feel like we need some positivity. Valerie did try to bring some positivity earlier. I thought that was great, saying that it really could bring allies out and cause, another wave of protests and people speaking up for what they want and what they think is right. So,
And I think it also gives hope to, if there is someone that belongs to a conservative family or whatever political affiliation you might have. It doesn't have to necessarily be that you belong to a conservative family. Even if you're in a liberal, moderate, whatever, seeing that news story, but especially on Fox News, seeing that news story might help someone out who's in a similar predicament, like having, whether it's conservative in a political sense or conservative in like a cultural sense, might reach out. Like that story will reach them and be like, oh, okay, maybe I can identify as this. Maybe I do identify as this. Like, maybe all hope is not lost. So I think it's still, either way, kind of amazing that, Fox News pushed a story like an interview like that, for sure.
So we'll move on to the final question we have, which it was actually a bigger part of the bill, even though people refer to it as the Don't Say Gay bill, is that critical race theory is a huge component, as we were talking earlier. How do you think the bill would affect classrooms concerning discussions of race? So just as it would affect LGBTQIA plus kids, how would it affect kids of different races? I mean, I would say especially Black Americans in our country.
I would say 100%, especially Black and Indigenous Americans, for sure.
Then again, it's the same thing when you're talking about families in a first grade or in a kindergarten class. So now you can't say where your family comes from, can't talk about your culture, you can't talk about your traditions. It doesn't make sense.
I'm still trying to read some of this and be like, wait, is this something we can do or we can't do? Like, it's so confusing. I'm trying to figure this out because, I go back to the part that Monor highlighted, about American values and slavery and racism. And, anything other than deviations from betrayals of failures to live up to authentic founding principles of the United States, which include liberty and equality. So I'm guessing they're saying the only thing you can teach is that the United States was founded on liberty and equality. But and I mean, if you read the founding documents, that's what you can read in them, that hope, that positivity, we the people. But if you get a little bit further into it, 3/5, and there's nothing that guarantees any rights for women, for minorities, for anyone really. It's very vague. But just reading this, they're talking about the slavery and racism or anything other than deviations, well, then it sounds like you should be teaching that slavery and racism are deviations, which should be something that is positive, because then you can acknowledge our history and you can say, everyone in this country has a place in this country because what happened in the past was wrong. And so let's acknowledge that and let's move forward with that understanding. And so when you understand the past, I really do think that you can work toward a better future. And that doesn't mean that you necessarily need to have a debate on reparations in a 6th grade history class or whatever. No one's saying that, but that's what they think. The people who wrote this bill, that's what they think that these teachers want to do, is to put down white people and raise up minorities and blame everyone for the past. I do genealogy. I know what my ancestors did. It wasn't great, but that's not me. But by knowing what they did, I can better represent that history and share it and, be an example of how I'm not them, and I don't hate people and I don't feel blamed I don't feel blamed for my ancestors. I don't feel like anyone's blaming me personally. And so, but I think people get defensive and they feel blamed.
The thing is that like, we just want accountability. That's it. Point blank, period, right? We're not saying that, we're not trying to badmouth the US and the education system and how it's shaped and taught us over the years, but to blatantly like suppress that history is doing us a disservice too. And it's not that we're trying to, like you said, like have a debate about reparations in the middle of a sixth grade like history class. Like that's, we just want that awareness, the act, like the honest representation of what happened here, because that's still a part of our history, whether you cover it or not. Whether you teach it in a classroom, you can easily still find more information on Google because Google is free. Like, what makes you think that kids won't go out of their way, students won't go out of their way to do extra research outside of school because they won't let you talk about it, especially if you are someone who is Black, Indigenous, or a person of color? You already know some of the history just by the color of your skin, just by merely existing. And to go to school and be like, wow, they never talked about XYZ, that's kind of weird. And then you end up having those conversations with your parents or your friends outside of that school setting. And like I said before, if they're going to be curious about it, they're going to find a way to look it up, whether it's allowed in school or not. This is the age of the internet, like more than ever, especially after like our generations, like Gen Z. And after that, like they are in the peak of the like age of the internet, and that nothing's going to stop them from trying to find out that information. It's going to happen, whether you do it in school, whether you do it outside of school.
I think if it's coming from school, it can be hopefully like professionally, knowledgeably curated and presented responsibly. You can have primary sources. You can let them, think critically about the content, because everyone has their biases, So if you learn from multiple teachers, you learn from your community, you hear opposing opinions, that's all great. The more information that you can get on a topic, the better informed you can be. And so, sure, let the kids read this bill, let them see what people don't want them to hear. And so then they say, okay, well, you don't want me to hear about this. Why? What's negative about this? Teach me why this would be a bad thing to learn about, And so you can think critically and learn these skills, so you don't just blindly believe what you get from one source that you do Google, because they're going to Google. And who says they find something good?
Ashley says it's definitely already happening with Gen Z as far as finding out info for themselves outside of what the school tells them. That's a very good point. And like you guys are saying, we all have biases. And I think that's maybe a deeper issue there. People don't want to acknowledge that they have these biases. Maybe they don't quite understand, that there are explicit ways of demonstrating discrimination versus implicit ways of showing discrimination. And I think we have to all be uncomfortable. We all have to be okay with getting uncomfortable, because that's the only way we can move forward. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck, is they don't want to acknowledge that they have these biases, that there's something that could be potentially negative that they perceive about others or a group of people, but that's the reality of it. It's kind of like acknowledging you have a problem first before moving forward and making progress. So I honestly think a lot of this starts with self-reflection and kind of understanding who you are, and always trying to educate yourself, like you were saying. Always educate yourself. Never fully accept that you know everything, because that's the point when you become willfully ignorant, and that's dangerous. Did you guys want to talk about the article that Lennon sent out? Texas-based hate group was behind attempted riot at Pride event in Idaho. This just happened. And what was the group called? Patriot Front. that actually they wanted to start a riot at a pride event in Idaho. They're out of Texas, and apparently they try to go to events whenever they can outside of Texas. And they could have potentially, this could have been potentially very dangerous, but thankfully it was stopped. This is all kind of a culmination of something that's a result of ignoring LGBTQIA plus communities and not educating. Obviously, there's always going to be hate in the world, but possibly if they understood or knew someone personally who was part of that community, maybe they wouldn't feel that way, or maybe they've had past trauma with someone who is part of that community. I think a lot of this has to do with personal experience or just not being educated enough. Do you guys have anything to say about this particular incident?
I think that that's the danger of this type of bills, increasing this type of negativity and hate groups, giving them more fuel to try to riot against parades and that type of events.
I agree with Lennon 100%. I think it's just gonna perpetuate and promote more violence, and that's honestly the last thing that we need is more violence in the world. Groups like this and then bills like this kind of feel like they go hand in hand and work in tandem to just be a menace to society, and it's genuinely the worst.
Yeah, people would just use like this sort of group, which I'm reading this and I'm like, oh, this sounds like Westboro Baptist Church. But when you pass bills like this, you're saying to this group that your ideology is correct, and it's sort of this militia thought process of we have to protect our community, we have to protect people, and we're getting the wink wink from the state to go do this. They're not going to say it out loud, but this is what they want. So in that way, these sorts of bills are very dangerous.
I mean, if you have a dissenting opinion, I mean, fine, but it's also the violence component, like you guys were saying. It's that's not acceptable. That's not a way to handle it. And of course, this particular instance, thankfully nothing happened, but I don't think it would have been labeled a domestic terrorist attack as it should have been. It never seems to be, at least.
And I think it's difficult because and I think many librarians are a strong proponent of the First Amendment. People have the right to express themselves, to express their beliefs, but not in a way that hurts other people. So it's difficult, I think, to figure out where that line is, to not cross it. Sometimes it can be really hard to define that, but anything that involves weapons, or you have to mask yourself for a reason that's not health related and hide in the back of a U-Haul, is probably not the way to go. But if you want to have an organization that presents a conservative viewpoint, that's your right. And you can spread that information, you can promote that information, but there should be a level of transparency there. And so if those groups are giving money to politicians, that would be good to know. And people get to elect their politicians. It's all gerrymandered and everything, but still. So you're not saying you can't say these things. You're not saying you can't have these beliefs, but you are saying you can't use violence and intimidation to try and take away someone else's rights.
And in a way, you cannot, I mean, at least for me, I can't think that there were no intentions of any violence, because why would you be hiding? Why would you be all masked and all covered and in a, like I said, hiding if you're not, if your intentions are peaceful intentions, non-violent?
Exactly. And they said there was at least one smoke grenade involved. So, I mean, come on.
And to be honest with you, I mean, there was no really a lot of media attention as to what was found in that track. And at this, with everything that goes on, I don't know if the media is also just not informing the public about everything.
Yeah, they probably aren't. I want to hope that it's for good reason, for investigation, but you just don't know.
I think that there's a lack of critical analysis in media at this point too, because if they can just show like some random person's phone video and oh shocking and move on, but don't evaluate what happened. At the same time, there's so much in the news right now, like I can't keep track of it. January 6th hearings, just so many things. So they are limited on time, but it would be great if they use that time wisely and not just for shock value.
I feel like for me, that's why I don't usually watch traditional news on TV anymore. I'm also, when I'm watching TV, I'm watching TV for escapism at this point. So I don't want to watch the news when I get home. I'm watching Netflix or Hulu, But that's why I think for me, I'd rather read the articles because I also just absorb information better that way. And so that's why I subscribe to a couple of different newsletters. So I get those newsletters every day and I can read about like some of the hard hitting stuff that's happening and like continuations of things that happened like a couple months ago, last year, like the Ahmaud Arbery trial. And the fact that it's like a 24-hour news cycle, everything will just stop after a day, and then you won't hear about it again until something like crazy surrounding that situation is happening. So I think the newsletters are also a really helpful way to stay informed on what's going on. Even if you just read article titles and the little blurb that's with it, even if you don't click into the article, I feel like that's still even good enough to like be like, okay, cool, now I know, and then like go on to the next one. But having several different sources to have your understanding be more well-rounded, I think is also very important.
I think there's some attempts at censorship in the bill as well regarding, books. I think it's, kind of subtle, but, school or program personnel may not discourage or prohibit parental notification and involvement in critical decisions affecting a student's mental, emotional, physical well-being, health, or well-being. Oh, well, the kid checked out this book from the library. I need to let the parent know, that sort of thing. And so I think it does edge into, because I know that's a conversation about if parents should have access to children's library books, especially in schools, what should be on the shelves. So I think because that bill has come up a couple times in the Georgia legislature and it hasn't gotten very far. So I think there's a hint of that here, that parents should have more involvement in the curriculum, which this whole thing, and just the activities that the kids are doing at school. So, and I think they're using the health and well-being of the child as an excuse and not as a true concern for the kids.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I think one of the articles said that, it's just an easy way for Republicans to get their voters to rally around them, essentially. So, yeah, I don't think it's for the best interest of the child, unfortunately. So, if you enjoyed today's discussion, please join us again on Thursday, August 18th at 6:30 p.m. When we discuss how environmentalism and racial justice issues are inherently linked. Registration is required, and you can sign up by going to www.gwinnettpl.org and clicking on the calendar link or the event link for August 18th, or by calling our customer contact center at 770-978-5154, and the link will be up soon. Thank you, guys.